Washington State University. Go Cougs!
Hello and welcome back to the course on collecting smartphone sensor data using iOS. In part 4 of the first module, we'll be building the interface for our sensor app. Here is a screenshot of Xcode and the storyboard that shows the completed interface. As you can see, we are going to be adding several labels. These labels will eventually be used to display the sensor information. We'll also have a label for displaying messages to the user. And then down at the bottom, we'll have 3 buttons to start and stop the sensors and to send sensor data to a remote server. So let's go into Xcode and start building this interface. So I'll start up Xcode. You'll see we still have our sensor app folder and our playground that we created earlier. So I'll do File, Open, and on the desktop we'll open our sensor app. So here we are in the storyboard, and we have the sensor app label highlighted and its properties over here. But next we're going to be adding several labels to display our sensor information. So let's go down here in the palette and grab a label and drag it in, and I'll use the left margin guideline as the place to put it, and we're going to call this just motion to make it a heading. Now to position this and using our auto layout constraints, I'm going to keep the left margin as it is. So if I go down here, add new constraints, I'll see that it's currently set to 0, and that is, if we click on this little expand in, we see that that's 0 in relation to the view. Now if I were to, what's really going on here is there's a margin, a 16-point margin that comes with the view. So the motion label is actually up against that margin. If I were to uncheck the constraint to margins, you'll see this changes to 16. So it's really 16 away, but we'll go ahead and leave the constraint to margins checked because we want to leave a margin all around the view so things aren't right up against the edge. So for this one, we'll leave it at 0. As for the vertical, I'm going to do it a little different. So let me go ahead and click on this to add our left margin constraint. Now for the vertical, I'm going to do it a little differently. I'm going to control click on the sensor app label and drag down to the next label and then choose vertical spacing. What this does is it sets the vertical spacing of the motion label relative to wherever the sensor app label is placed. Now if I want to check and see just how much space is there, I can click on this and go up here to what's called connections. And sorry, this is the ruler, the size inspector. If I click on that and scroll down, I'll see the layout constraints that I've added. So in this leading space, I see that it's set to the view as I want. And in relation to the sensor app label, it's 9 points below. And I'm going to change that, and I want to set that to 8, just because that's how I did it for all of the screenshots that show up in your notes, and I want to make sure it stays consistent. Okay, so that has positioned the motion label both vertically and horizontally. Next, we're going to add some labels for the acceleration data, and I'm going to indent those a little bit, and we'll set that indent exact in just a second. This label, we're going to call it acceleration in the X direction, And I'm going to go ahead and put this colon space 0.0 here. Obviously this value is going to change, but I'm putting the 0.0 there just as a reminder that a number will be there, and so that when the view first loads up, the user will see that 0.0 there and realize that a number is coming, whereas if we left it blank, it may look like something is missing. So I'll do that for all of my sensors, so their initial value is just 0.0. Okay, so again, for the vertical spacing, I'm going to use this control-click drag approach from the motion label, choose vertical spacing, and that will add the appropriate vertical spacing for the acceleration label. And then for the horizontal, for that one, there's lots of ways we could do it, but you can see that it's relative to the view and the margin. I'm going to shift it over 8 points here. So I'll change that to 8, and it highlights the left margin indicator there, and I'll add that constraint. So we've got it indented just a little bit so we know that this is kind of under the context of motion. Okay, so next up we'll add the acceleration in the Y direction. So double click on it to add, change the text of the label. We'll set the vertical spacing, again using the control drag from the one above it. Now for the horizontal spacing, instead of setting them all relative to the left margin, I'm going to start setting them relative to the label above. So again, I'm going to control click drag, and in this case I'm going to set leading, and what that does is it sets the leading space to the same as the one that I control dragged from. So now those two will be lined up, and I'm going to do that for all of these labels. So next we'll do acceleration Z, and control drag once for vertical spacing, control drag again, set the leading space, and now we're all lined up. So that's for the accelerometer, and then for the gyroscope, the rotation data, we'll set those 3. So first one will be rotation along the x-axis, and just as a reminder, I'll put in that this is referred to as the pitch. Again, control click vertical spacing, control drag leading space, and it's all lined up. Rotation y-axis, which is referred to as roll, and we'll lay that out vertically and horizontally. And then finally the rotation z, which is called the yaw. Set its constraints. Okay, so that's the labels that will be used to display the motion data. Next, we'll do the labels that will display the location data. So I'll create a new heading label here called location. I'll set its vertical constraint to be relative to the rotation z. And then for the horizontal constraint, I could set its leading space to the same as motion, or I could just set it relative to the view. So I'm going to go ahead and do it relative to the view. It's already set to 0 using the margin, so we'll do that. And then for the 3 values we want to show, the first one is the latitude. set the vertical constraint using the control drag. And then for the horizontal constraint, I'm going to set it as I said, acceleration X relative to the view. So 8 points to the right of the view margin, which is the same as these others, but we'll set it independently here. Okay, then same for longitude. Set the vertical relative to latitude, and we'll also use the leading space technique to make it the same as latitude. And then finally, altitude. Set its vertical and set the leading. Okay, so that's all of the labels that will display our sensor information. We also wanted a label for a message, so I'm going to start by approximately centering that. I'll just give it the name message for now. And to center it, I'll be using the alignment constraint. I want to align it horizontally in the container or the view. So I'll check that. So that'll mean whatever message I wind up displaying there will be centered. And then for the vertical constraint, I will again use the control drag to make it relative to that last altitude measurement. So I'll select vertical spacing there. And again, just to make it consistent with all of the pictures in the notes, I want to make this 32 points. So let me click on message, go over to the ruler and check. Okay, it's set to 30, but I want that to be 32. So let me click edit, change it to 32, and that'll shift it down just a little bit. So that'll give us a little bit of space between the sensor data and the message, so that it's a little more obvious when it changes. Okay, now lastly, we want to add 3 buttons down at the bottom. So I'll click and drag the button element, and it gives me lots of suggestions here. I'm going to move it up a little bit. So if we look at the suggestions, you'll see that again, we're up against the margin on the left, which is good, and we're 20 points up from the very bottom of the view, which turns out to be a typical position for a button, so that we can kind of get our whole finger on it without going off the screen. So we'll use those 2 constraints to position the button, and this will be our start button. So I'll change its name to start. Next, we'll do the stop button. We want that to be centered, and again, the same vertical distance from the bottom. So to center it, we use the alignment constraint to center it horizontally, and then the vertical constraint will be 20 up from the bottom layout guide. And we'll call that one stop. And lastly, we'll have a send button, and we want that to be up against the right margin, 20 up from the bottom. So I'll add those 2 constraints, change its name to send. Okay, so we're done designing the interface. Let's go ahead and run this just to make sure that everything is positioned correctly. Again, using the iOS simulator. Okay, so there we see our app now. It has the various labels and buttons. Of course, the buttons don't do anything yet. If we try rotating our view, we see that we have a little bit of problem down here, mainly because we've got so much information on our screen that these two overlap. Probably the best way to address this is to prevent the app from being able to rotate, and we'll do that a little later. But for now, if we keep it in the portrait mode, things look lined up pretty well. Okay, so that completes our design of the interface. Of course, the next step is to start connecting these various elements to actual code that will implement the behavior of our app. So in the next part, we'll be doing that.